Social, political, and religious groups have been engaging in terrorist activities for as long as they have existed. However, many historians point to the French Revolution as the first act of modern terrorism. This may be because the term terrorism was coined to describe the event, or because it satisfies the four defining characteristics of a terrorist act. The first of these defining characteristics is that the act is a violent one, or one that threatens violence, and is exceedingly clear in the French Revolution and its aftermath, in which any person who dissented against the most powerful political group was subject to public beheading. The public aspect of these events leads to the second characteristic, which is the intent to cause widespread fear. Indeed, there is an almost theatrical element to terrorist actions, which leads them to be ever more damaging. It is also by this factor that some scholars qualify government and media groups as engaging in terrorism through acts like fear-mongering. The third aspect of terrorism is its political, social, or religious intent. For an act to be considered a terrorist one, as opposed to simply a violent crime, the perpetrator must be attempting to incite some kind of change. This was clearly demonstrated by the event of the Haymarket riots, in which workers and police clashed after a bomb exploded at a protest with police, civilians, and protesters all in attendance. Which brings us to the final characteristic, that terrorist actions usually engage non-combatants or civilians. Often, this means that the attacks are either somewhat random or appear to be random, causing the perception that they could occur to anyone at any time. At the turn of the 20th century, as the imperial nature of many of the world powers began to reach its zenith, terrorist activity began to happen more and more frequently, as the feedback loop that is the cycle of terrorism began to pick up steam.
Tipper truck packed with explosives went off in the city of London this morning. It killed one man and injured more than 40 others. Some estimates put the cost of the damage at over £1 billion. The bomb exploded in Bishopsgate near the NatWest Tower. Police had received IRA-coded warnings but were still evacuating the area when it went off. Happened close to the Baltic Exchange, blocked by an IRA bomber unit.
The column of smoke rises above the city skyline, awaiting Londoners in little doubt terrified. A shockwave was felt over a wide area. The explosion heard several miles away. Chief paramedics walked into the nearby office and knew immediately.
A giant pillar of smoke rose an adjacent 25-story high rise. The blast is audible over 8 miles away.
Police had received coded warnings about the bomb which had been dropped at a short distance.
As a single largest bomb to off here since
medics were among the first on the scene and dispersed
in the explosion's aftermath, firefighters battled 20 additional fires.
Windows sending glass shower.
The devastation is absolute. Windows are blown out up to a half-mile
bombers
away.
clearly hope to cause maximum destruction.
Damage from the blast is large.
New York City and all the events here obviously had detonated a terror attack in New York City.
Traumatized and injured covered.
The increase in the pace of terrorist activity, as well as the specific locations of this activity, reveals three major insights. That an increase in political and social inequity is linked to higher incidence of terrorism, that the profusion of terror through media exacerbates these acts, and that terrorism often leads to more terrorism. To understand the reasons for this, we must first understand some of the sociological concepts that engage this phenomenon. The first is social stratification, the system in which different classes of people are separated by wealth, power, and social standing. The second concept is that of a hegemony, or the ideological system that stabilizes that stratification. Another important concept is best construed by Max Weber's statement that the state is defined by its monopoly on the legitimate use of force. So, terrorism occurs when a group without social or political clout wants to incite change. However, because of the stratification of society, They are not enabled to enact this without using violence. Of course, this in no way justifies the violent actions. However, the response to terrorist acts in legal, urban, political, social, media, and military terms is often problematic. This is because the class with higher power often gains more power in physical and ideological terms immediately after an attack, leaving the group whose main purpose was to have their views heard even more ostracized. This cycle has been occurring since the advent of terrorism with the French Revolution. The redesign of Paris is one of the early examples of militarization of urban spaces. The redesign arose primarily from the need to defend against uprisings in Paris. From 1790 to 1850, France had transitioned between royal dynasties, republic, and empires 6 different times. The narrowed streets of Paris were easy to establish a barricade, and the winding, disorganized layout made it difficult for troops to mobilize against these makeshift walls. Because of this, Napoleon III commissioned public works administrator George Eugene Haussmann to redesign Paris into the emperor's new vision. The project destroyed some 20,000 buildings and erected 30,000 new ones. In all, an estimated 60% of Paris's buildings were rebuilt or transformed. The project required a huge expenditure and was massively over budget, at over 2.5 billion francs. Many Parisians had a negative outlook on the project, citing concerns over never-ending construction, debt, and distrust in its initial budgeting. The street widening process consists of 3 stages. First, the government identified the buildings that were in the way. Then, it would acquire these properties by a written mandate. Ultimately, these buildings will be demolished to make way for the new boulevards that are still the distinctive feature of Paris today. Ironically, these boulevards, which were initially widened so that troops can move around the city for its defense, now serve as weapons for vehicular attacks by terrorists. There was also social impacts resulting from this renovation. After the redesign, there was an increase in social segregation due to the rise in rent and property price. It is still visible between the eastern and western urban areas of Paris. The poorest was marginalized and the richest was protected. It seems as though designing against terrorism was ultimately futile. Changes in technology have made the redesign of Paris problematic, as its large, straight streets have been shown to be easier to use in car-related attacks. This redesign also further empowered the rich and further suppressed the impoverished. Human beings have put up barriers to guard against attacks since ancient times. To protect citizens from invading northern tribes, the first London Wall was erected by the Romans over a span of time from 55 BC to the 5th century AD. London was only but a small outpost of the Roman Empire at the time. The modern-day Ring of Steel came about as a result of defending against the bombing campaigns of the Irish Republican Army.
Bollards. Silent. Inscrutable. And is it just me, or are there a lot more of them about these days? This is the edge of the Ring of Steel, the protective security cordon that throws its arms around the City of London. 6.5 miles of subtle obstructions like gates and bollards and CCTV cameras and chicanes. The Ring of Steel was introduced in the early 1990s, when provisional IRA bombs sought to tear at the heart of the city. In its early form, it consisted of traffic cones and policemen, leading some to dub it the Ring of Plastic. Low-tech perhaps, but very, very visible. Over the past 17 years, this ring has evolved to the point where it is now almost invisible. Walk through it, and you'd hardly know it's there. Last year, the photographer Henrietta Williams and cartographer George Gingell began a project to map it and show how the city has been changed to make it easier to police. So what are the key features of the Ring of Steel?
Well, the point is, they needed to be able to check all the traffic coming in, and so you close down the sort of 50-odd roads into the city, and you have a few which just become one-ways out, and then you've got 19 entry points, and it's very easy to control it.
We've got like streets being blocked, and then buildings being placed over where there would have been throughways. We've got bollards, we've got flower planting and trees being planted.
Basically, as you go down Bishopsgate, all the streets on this side will either be blocked or will have cameras on them.
Have you seen how it changes behaviour of people and flow of people and so on?
Yeah, definitely. I mean, I think what happens is that you're only welcome within these spaces if you're going to kind of engage with them commercially. So either you work in the building or you're going to go and spend money in that shopping mall. It's not really for people to linger in. There are benches, but they're actually designed as ways of blocking roads.
Even with these counter-terrorist measures, vehicular attacks around Europe have only intensified security officials' paranoia in London.
All right, we are following breaking news out of Berlin, where a truck has ploughed through a Berlin Christmas market.
Some breaking news. Reports are coming in of an attack, or quite possibly several attacks, in Paris. Reports are talking of a burst of gunfire at a restaurant in the 10th arrondissement. Now, the details are still sketchy.
The Third London Ring of Steel was proposed in response to these events. However, all this militarization of urban spaces did not guarantee safety.
Breaking news out of London, a deadly terror attack overnight.
You're looking live here at the aftermath, a heavy police presence on the London Bridge where the attack began.
The assault began shortly after 10 o'clock London time. A white van driving on the London Bridge swerves, leaves the roadway, and starts plowing into pedestrians.
We heard a crash almost.
A big loud noise.
A lot of loud noises.
That van coming to a stop just past the end of London Bridge steps away from the bustling Borough Market. Police say at least 3 men leave the van and race toward the area. Armed with long blades, they start slashing and stabbing people indiscriminately.
It is only a matter of time before new security measures come up. This race between terrorist events and increasing security measures is a self-fueled cycle that only amplifies after each side has made its move. September 11th, 2001. 4 planes were hijacked by 19 terrorists in a plot to cripple the U.S. economy by attacking Wall Street, the Pentagon, and the White House. The first 2 planes hit Tower 1 and Tower 2 of the World Trade Center, which led to the collapse of both as well as Tower 7. American Airlines Flight 77 crashed into the Pentagon. The final plane did not make it to its target thanks to the bravery of its passengers stopping the terrorists. After 9/11, buildings are now built to resist bomb explosions with expensive upgrades.
The outside of the core, this whole center spine of the building is out of concrete.
It is 6 feet thick, and it's not just any concrete, a new formulation that makes it much stronger. The end result? Concrete that can withstand loads of 14,000 feet per square inch, 3 times the strength of the garden variety. But there is more to Child's core design than a lot of super strong concrete. The stairs are much wider, and the air inside will be kept at a higher pressure than the rest of the building to keep smoke out in a fire.
The first 19 stories of this building are built like a bunker to protect this structure from the force of a car bomb. Eventually, they'll be covered over with glass, bomb-resistant glass.
All these enhanced safety measures focusing on high-rises and vital financial districts seem futile in the face of the new perpetrators have now shifted to soft targets, and we still have massacres going on outside of urban areas. There was a decline in tourism in the whole country, and hotels, restaurants, and retailers were affected. More than 250,000 jobs were lost. In total, there was an estimated 2.5 million jobs lost within the first 18 months after 9/11. Local law enforcement were allowed to share the fingerprints of arrestees with Homeland Security. The National Security Agency, or NSA, changed from being an agency that spied on foreign terrorists to surveillance of communications of American citizens here at home, and often without a warrant or notice. All aspects of a person's life are policed by governing agencies, and all citizens are suspects. Their activities monitored and regulated, their movements tracked, their communications spied upon, and their lives, liberties, and pursuit of happiness dependent on the government's say-so.
Section 215 is overseen by a secret intelligence court known as the FISA Court, and they've interpreted it to mean the government could basically collect and store phone records for every American, the vast majority of whom, of course, have no connection to terrorism.
The Patriot Act makes it easy for the government to access private information without probable cause. The profusion of the internet has made this even more impactful because there's much more of that information stored. Further, the maturing of the internet has led to a whole new type of terrorism. Cyber terror. To protect their interests, governments have begun to build teams and technologies that allow them to engage on this front. Indeed, these teams have already proved their prowess in major hacks like Stuxnet,
was discovered lurking in the databanks of power plants, traffic control systems, and factories around the world. 20 times more complex than any previous virus code, it had an array of capabilities. Among them, the ability to turn up the pressure inside nuclear reactors or switch off oil pipelines. The virus may have shut down 1,000 centrifuges at Natanz, Iran's main enrichment facility, last year. In November, the International Atomic Energy Agency, the UN's nuclear watchdog, said Iran had suspended work at its nuclear facilities without explaining why. Many observers credited Stuxnet. Last month, the Iranian government conceded the virus's infection of the Bashir nuclear facility, still under construction, meant that switching the plant on could lead to a national electricity blackout. Some have it that Israel is responsible because the virus code apparently contains references to the Hebrew Bible. Others believe the US was involved in the testing and development. Stuxnet was a weapon, the first to be made entirely out of code.
With the current trend towards the Internet of Things, in a completely connected world, what could the new consolidation of power look like?
May I help you?
Oh, good afternoon. We're just in the neighborhood doing some free tree trimming.
No, thank you. I'm not interested.
In a world where every aspect of our lives is becoming a venue for the expansion of control, the possible consolidation of power and accompanying subjugation of fringe groups will intensify the cycle we have shown here. Maybe it is time to step out of the cycle. Stop reacting to terrorism by engaging groups who have views, not from a position of immovable strength, but one of attentive openness.